Welcome to AnthroDish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dignan. Diet culture on the internet is great at sensationalizing our food to the point of panic. I'm sure many of you have seen the videos across TikTok or Instagram where someone positions themselves as an expert and demonizes strawberries, bread, or my beloved potatoes. But what happens when we take a more proactive and less restrictive approach to how we look at our food and diets? My guest today is the delightful Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, who is the founder of Nutrivore.com and the New York Times bestselling author of Nutrivore, the radical new science for getting the nutrients you need from the food you eat. She creates educational resources to help people improve their day-to-day diet and lifestyle choices, empowered and informed by the most current evidence-based scientific research. With Nutrivore, Dr. Sarah has created a positive and inclusive approach to dietary guidance based in science and devoid of dogma, using nutrient density and sufficiency as its basic principles. She's looking at nourishment, not judgment. On today's show, we're breaking down why diet-centric approaches don't work, busting myths around food fears, and Dr. Sarah explains her Nutrivore mindset. It's a huge pleasure to be able to have a conversation with someone who not only has so much nutritional knowledge, but also an approach that is sustainable and realistic. So I'm very excited to share this conversation with you all. Here's my conversation with Dr. Sarah. All right, welcome to the show, Dr. Sarah. How are you doing today?
I am wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to chat with you. I always feel like this extra sense of excitement when I've connected with someone online and then we actually get to have a full conversation. But for those who don't know you, do you mind sharing a snapshot of who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
So I think of myself as a science communicator in the health and nutrition space. That is definitely a self-applied title, though. I have a PhD in medical biophysics and a background in medical research, and found myself in this very circuitous, unconventional path to having an online presence and being a person who reads science for a living and then interprets it in a way that's actionable that people can actually to improve their day-to-day lives. I kind of found my way here accidentally. I second postdoctoral research fellowship, had my first daughter, and was not healthy. I was really struggling. And because of all of those factors, I decided to take some time off of my academic path. In America, we have a program from the National Institutes of Health called Reentry Grants for Women that allow women to take up to 8 years off of their academic careers, and then it sort of funds and supports reentry into academia, which is a very, very cool program.
Yeah.
And there's no limits, right? It's whatever reasons women need to take time off, right? Because we do find ourselves often really drawn between multiple different roles that society expects of us. And so it's a wonderful program. So that was my initial intention. Was I'm going to utilize this program. I'm going to stay home with my kids while they're young. My second daughter was born a couple years later. Then when it was time to make the decision and go back, I was like, but I have this audience online and have this opportunity to write books, and I have this megaphone, and there's not in this space, right? There's not enough people who are in good faith interpreting scientific literature in a way that is accessible and actionable for the general public, that's not fear-based pseudoscience misinformation, right? That is most of what we see in terms of diet and nutrition recommendations online. There's more bad information out there right now than good information. And so I think I've kind of felt by that time where I was like, do I go back into academia or do I keep following this path? It felt to me like this path was more important and also a better match for my skill set, right? It's not easy for a lot of scientists to explain what they do in plain language. And I think part of the reason why I can do that is because even in my academic career, I switched fields several times. My bachelor's degrees in physics, my PhDs in medical biophysics. I switched into critical care medicine for my first postdoctoral research fellowship, and then into cell biology, cellular trafficking, how a cell moves things within it from part to part within the cell for my second postdoctoral research fellowship. And I think that the experience of having to learn an entirely new field and a new set of jargon, right? All of the technical terms, I think that is what makes me such a good communicator now, because I had to do it so many times. I remember when I started my PhD that first week, my supervisor, the PI, handed me a bunch of papers that were from his lab so that I could understand the field that I was now expected to do research in. And I had to read those journal articles with a medical dictionary beside me.
Oh my gosh.
I had to go like, what is a leukocyte? Come on, like what? It's a white blood cell. It's a type of white blood cell. But like every third, fourth word, I was like, I don't know what this is. I have to go look it up and figure out what it is. And I think that experience keeps me grounded in plain language in a way that people, really resonate with, right? And then also I think my experience in the health space as being somebody who really struggled with health issues and who struggled with, my entry into this was in the world of restrictive dieting, and then having to realize that I had a learned eating disorder from being in that space and then having to overcome that. I think that experience also grounds the philosophy and the emotion behind the resources that I create. So I really understand how easy it is to fall for nutrition misinformation, because I did. And then I had to relearn and, deepen my knowledge to correct that misinformation in my brain. And I also understand how much we learn, just yearn for control, right? We just want to feel like all I need to do is this, and then I will feel great, right? And I want to live in a world where health really is my personal responsibility, and all I need to do is follow some simple rules and I'll have great health. That unfortunately is healthism. And there are lots of things that control our health that we have no control over. Lots of things that influence our choices that we have no control over. So I think that kind of having that experience of really struggling with my health and finding, I wouldn't say nutritional solutions, but nutritional approaches that helped, right?
Right.
Being able to find that balance, I think helps me kind of also speak that language that is very much what diet and wellness culture is right now, and sort of understand, right, what it's like over there, and then invite people to come safely over here to learn some new information rooted in science that will help them have a healthier relationship with food and their own bodies while improving diet quality.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that too, because I think that was something where, myself included, when I came up in food anthropology, I was really struggling with my own disordered eating through sport, and the relationship between food and education and sport were so commingled that I kind of want to circle back, because you had mentioned the idea of science communication in good faith, and particularly when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to diet, we see, as you spoke to, there's so much pseudoscience, there's so much misinformation. Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to why this sort of approach to food persists around the idea of diet and nutrition, and why it doesn't necessarily work?
Yeah, I think that we're now in the third generation of people, or fourth generation of people who have learned about healthy eating with the framework around that of these are the bad foods you don't eat. Right. So this goes back to the 70s with all of the fear around saturated fat and cholesterol. Then in the 90s, that kind of switched gears and became the fear around carbohydrates, right? Low carb diets took off. Early 2000s has been diets like paleo took off. The 2010s, where we saw keto and carnivore. You had also vegetarianism and veganism gain popularity in the 80s and 90s. And we've got to a point now where every food is demonized by somebody. Even water is demonized.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? There's literally nothing that is safe to eat if you bought into kind of every single diet's rhetoric that's out there right now. But I also think we got here in a very that's human nature kind of way. So when you frame a diet based on what you cut out, right? This is a low-fat diet, so you don't eat these foods that are high in fat, right? This is a low-carb diet, you don't eat these foods that are high in carbohydrates, or the various iterations of that have gotten even more specific and more extreme over the years. When you go on one of those diets, let's face it, most of the time the goal is weight loss, because society has also told us that thin and healthy are the same thing, even though unequivocally false, right? that is not, those two words actually have different definitions. Wow. But what happens is any diet pretty much works for weight loss initially. And then you hit this wall, right? So when you are restricting foods, the psychological effect of that is to increase food fixation, food cravings, food obsession. Then you hit that moment of, okay, just this one time, right? Oh, I deserve this, right? Or I'm at this place, I'll do this one thing. But that one time you break that rule, instead of it just being I indulged, is that moment of the yo-yo where we go from downwards to upwards, right? It's called disinhibition in the psychological research. And it's that moment where, because you broke that rule, whether that rule is legitimate or not, it doesn't matter, right? Because I broke that rule, all of my health behaviors unravel. And what we know now from a huge body of scientific literature is the more times you yo-yo, the more times your weight cycles up and down, the higher your health risks are, higher than if you had never tried to lose weight in the first place. But I think what happens with restrictive diets is you get that initial success, right? It works until that moment of disinhibition, or until you hit that like equilibrium of your increased hunger and your decreased metabolism. And now whatever the structure is that created an energy deficit, because that's how these all work to achieve weight loss. Now that's not an energy deficit anymore because I have this adaptation within my body, right? So we hit this moment where it doesn't work anymore. We've hit a wall. But if you've credited your initial success to the things you cut out, and not what you ate instead, the very natural human nature thing to do is go, I just need to cut out more. Oh, I just need to cut out the next thing. Oh, I just need to, instead of cutting out this, I'll cut out this whole entire other group of foods, right? So that's why you see people switch from vegan to carnivore or back and forth, right? We go from actually, now I don't think this diet did work, right? Maybe I rebounded too much, or I had some other health issues. So I'm going to switch to this other completely restrictive mindset around foods. And I think we've just had now 50, 60 years of iterating on this psychology. And we now have plenty of evidence that it doesn't work, that it's not sustainable, that it doesn't help us eat a healthier diet over the long term, which is what we actually want to do in order to reduce our risk of health problems in the future. But it's what the entire diet and weight loss industry is based upon. The entire diet and weight loss industry is based upon you not having a high knowledge base about nutrition. So you are susceptible to believing whatever misinformation is out there. You not feeling good about your body because society is also trying to set ridiculously unrealistic standards about health and beauty. And it's like, you're going to fail, right? You're going to hit this point where this doesn't work anymore because no diet is designed to actually have you succeed. And then you'll buy the next thing, right? It's also designed to like just keep you in this infinite loop of having a little bit of success and then feeling frustrated and feeling like you failed the diet, not the diet failed you. Yeah. But it wasn't you, it was the diet.
Yes, without fail. And I think that idea of reframing it as designed, designed to fail, or kind of like a planned obsolescence of our own abilities in this industry is a really interesting and important way to look at it. And particularly, as you said, there's just so much rigorous evidence that it doesn't work. So I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to Nutrivore and the mindset that accompanies it, because it is one of those books where when I was reading it, I was like, oh, I really wish I read this when I was like 17, 18, and being, the ideal, I guess, kind of victim of diet culture because I wasn't food literate. I didn't have all these understandings of like what nutrition was. So can you speak more to the Nutrivore mindset that you bring?
I would love to. I mean, it's very much the culmination of both my professional and personal experiences, right? And it is what I think is the solution that the general public needs right now to move into a post-diet culture world. Mm-hmm. So Nutrivore, I refer to as simply the goal of getting all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat. I feel like that's sort of irrefutable logic. I've never had anybody challenge me on that being a bad idea. Right. So if you think of nutrients as all of the raw materials, all of the reagents that go into chemical reactions in our body, all of the things that make us us, but that also all of the functions that keep us going, That's what nutrients are. And the reason why we need to continuously top up our nutrients from our diets is because all of those chemical reactions are ongoing, right? We use up nutrients in all of these chemical reactions, so we need to add more nutrients to the system. And if you're short of even a small handful of nutrients, that creates this like wear and tear on those systems where they can't quite work quite right. And that wear and tear interacts with other health-related behaviors, how active we are, whether or not we smoke or drink, how much sleep we get. It reacts with our genetics and epigenetics, our gut microbiomes, our access to medical care, our social determinants of health, and like all together then increase risk for health problems. So we're not talking about cardiovascular disease as being a one-to-one tie to not getting enough nutrients from our diet, the way like scurvy or rickets would be.
Right.
But rather that there's 30 some odd nutrients we're not getting enough of from our diet creates that bit of strain that in the context of other risk factors then increases the likelihood of developing cardiovascular disease. So it's not a singular solution because it's not a disease of malnutrition, but it is still a clear point of intervention to reduce our risk. Not a guarantee because again, there's so many other things that are feeding into that system, but something that is within our power to do. So Nutrivore is about understanding that link, right? Understanding what nutrients do in our body, what foods contain what types of nutrients, how to combine different groups of foods to get the full range of nutrients our bodies need, but without engaging in restriction. Because the restrictive mindsets of the past don't help us adopt those healthy eating patterns, right? Rather than thinking of it as a diet that I'm going to do until I achieve this short-term goal, we really want to think of it as a way of life, right? As a way that I eat on average. And in order to attain that sort of sustainable nutrition, we necessarily have to be getting joy from our diets. If we are not enjoying the foods we're eating, if we're not able to indulge at a birthday party or a potluck or during, some celebration, then we are creating that sort of binge restrict cycle that gets us back into the on again, off again diet roller coaster, right? So as much as I've integrated nutritional sciences into the Nutrivore philosophy, I've also integrated this very permissive sort of anti-diet approach. You can absolutely take the nutritional sciences part if you have a diet that you love and you want to keep doing it. You can take the nutritional sciences part and improve the nutritional quality of your diet. You don't have to implement Nutrivore as an anti-diet, but I would say aligns more with anti-diet principles simply because I think that's the path to long-term healthy eating patterns for most people.
And do you find like within the research that you're looking at, and I'm not sure, actually, I guess if you could speak to like how prolific that sort of research is as well, but do you find that the science is starting to paint a picture of anti-diet approaches being more successful or more sustainable as well?
There's some really interesting studies to support that statement out of sort of the intuitive eating world.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen enough studies to support that statement with anti-diet approaches more broadly. So intuitive eating is one particular anti-diet approach. There's 10 principles, and I am not intuitive eating certified, so I am speaking based on what I've read in the scientific literature, not as an expert here. The 10th principle is gentle nutrition, which I feel aligns very much with what I'm trying to teach with Nutrivore. But there's also other psychological approaches with, eating when you're hungry, eating the foods you crave, giving yourself sort of unrestrained permission to eat those foods. And as somebody who's had to address my own food fears and work on expanding my diet, those principles have been very helpful for me personally to get to a point where now that I'm allowing myself to eat this food, I'm not eating all of it every single day. Like I think that recovery from restriction is sort of integrated into the intuitive eating protocols. And so there's over 100 studies with looking at intuitive eating, and generally show that the more somebody eats intuitively, so the more, even like if you haven't even learned how to intuitively eat, if you just kind of do it, because some people do, right? Some people just
magically
haven't dieted. It's hard to think of in this day and age, but there are still people out there who don't diet and just kind of eat intuitively still. So the higher you score on an intuitive eating scale, which is like a semi-quantification, right? We do a little survey and we assign points for your answers. But generally, the healthier they are, the lower their BMI and the higher the quality of their diet. So like as a general rule, that tends to correspond with overall healthier eating patterns. But I actually think we really need more research in this field, right? So in the sort of diet recovery space to compare different approaches to really like understand what is the best approach, like really like from a psychological standpoint, in addition to a physiological standpoint, for getting people to really accept that restriction doesn't serve them, to really stop moralizing foods and stop putting foods in these like two different buckets of like, these foods are good and therefore I'm good if I eat them, and these foods are bad and therefore I'm bad if I eat them, right? Like that moralization of foods is perpetuating all of the restrictive mindsets around food, along with sort of healthist views of food and people.
Yes.
So yeah, I think we need, I would definitely like, that would be my call to researchers in this space would be, we need more studies to really compare different anti-diet approaches, really understand what are the most important factors, what's the most important conversation to have or resource to give. When you look at habit formation research, right? So they'll have people like floss like twice a day, and we'll see if you still do it in 3 months, right? Like people who get more education and get explained why this is a good habit to have a much higher rate of having developed flossing as a habit 3 months later, right? So what is the education that we need for people recovering from diet culture to help not just eat in a permissive way and eat in a way that doesn't restrict, continue to eat the foods we love, get joy from food, but be able to do that and still add foods that are really nutritionally important, so we're still improving diet quality. Like how do we achieve both of those goals? Because I think they're both important. We don't just want to say culture is terrible, eat whatever you want. We want to teach people how to intuitively eat a balanced, nutritious, non-restrictive diet. And I would love to have more guidance on that part from like nutritional sciences and psychology research.
Yeah, because that's something that's really struck me in the past year or so, is just seeing, the amount of scientists coming out on social media just talking about, we had that example, I want to say it was like last year, where they just started using, or they had uncovered that they were using tampons soaked in water to look at like the menstrual predictions for tampon use, instead of actually looking at menstruation as a factor or other elements of like women's health in particular being the focus. And so it makes me wonder too about, the depths of what we don't know about how different bodies interact with foods, particularly, as you said, if they've been experiencing diet culture and restriction for so long, like how does that affect metabolisms differently, pieces like that too,
And sort of what's sort of referred to as nutrigenomics, right? So like where do our genetics impact our nutritional needs or how we metabolize different food compounds? I think one of the things I don't think people realize is how young the field of nutritional sciences is, just as a science, right? Its earliest beginnings are very, very late 1700s, early 1800s. Like a lot of nutrients were sort of identified as the chemical elements were identified during the chemical revolution, right? And we're like, oh, iodine, hey, that's important for the thyroid, cool, right? Like those just basically nutritional sciences is 200 years old, right? If you compare that to measurements of the Earth's circumference, which date back about 2,000 years, right? If you think about theory of gravity, was that 400 years old, right? We have much older sciences around, especially, physics, astronomy. Microscope was invented before the beginning of nutritional sciences. Like we knew about the cell long before nutritional sciences. Nutritional sciences came around the same time as the germ theory of disease, right? Like it is a very new science. And for its entire history, there have been people taking a little bit of information, making a bunch of assumptions based on it, and then spouting it as truth and having that take off and develop a life of its own, become conventional wisdom passed from generation to generation before the science to prove whether or not it's true, and often not true, is actually performed. You had politicians talking about how terrible carbohydrate-containing foods are before we knew about the Krebs cycle, 100 years before we knew about the Krebs cycle.
Right. Yeah.
100 years before we understood adenosine triphosphate and cellular respiration, like what happens to carbohydrates when we eat them, before the first 100 years before the first vitamin was identified, right? We had people basically saying, you should only eat the foods that I eat because if you eat the way I eat, you're a morally good person. This goes back to the very earliest beginnings of nutritional sciences. And I think that nutrition continues to make that same mistake. We continue to offer a megaphone to people to spout their beliefs about nutrition before the science is performed to inform those opinions. And it's also why there's so much distrust of government guidelines, because government dietary guidelines have often also preceded the necessary science to underpin them. And so I think that one of the most important jobs that it can do, and this community of science communicators like in this field can do, is to help increase people's not just knowledge of nutritional sciences, but like scientific literacy in general. So if you understand that science is a process, that we're iterating on human knowledge, that we never want to put too much stock into any individual study, that we want to look at for scientific consensus and where most of the research points to on a specific topic, and understand how you get these like landmark studies that change our interpretation, like how that comes about. And that we never want to say, look, here's this new study that says coffee's a miracle cure. Everybody, coffee's a miracle cure. Oh, look, here's this new study that says coffee destroys your health. Look, everybody, coffee destroys your health, right? Like science journalism in health topics, at least, doesn't do a very good job of communicating the context and nuance that is necessary for people to be able to interpret how to take that science and make it like make my choices based on it, right? And so if we can help people better understand the science, then we also leave room for, we've got new science and it turns out we were wrong about this thing. Here's where it is now, right? We need to leave room for, we don't know everything yet about nutrition. There's all these important details. We don't know if you have done X, Y, or Z diet that you need to now do this other thing because you need some different nutrients or, like you've got some kind of consequences. We want to be able to be leaving room for, now we have extra information that's really important and actionable. And the way we do that is by explaining how we know what we know and where the boundaries of that knowledge currently are.
Yes, I think that space for nuance, I mean, that's something that I find a lot of, as you said, a lot of science communicators don't always bring that to the table, and then it does have these ripple effects. And I'm curious, for you, you're operating in this really interesting online space where you've got all sorts, like even just thinking about TikTok and the proliferation of fears around toxins in foods or fears around the quality of foods that have come up more recently. How do you navigate that sort of reactive culture, or that culture that kind of thrives off of like clickbaity pieces, when you're bringing a really nuanced position to food and nutrients in the online space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that I've completely figured it out. My general approach, because I'm a scientist, is to bring all of the citations, right? Is to come at it very logically, basically treat every myth-busting topic as a literature review, right? Here's the entire body of scientific literature. Here's 100 citations of all meta-analyses that prove my case, right? And so I do try to approach, especially myth busting, especially those really like pervasive myths that get people very upset when you say something contrary to their beliefs. I try to approach that with a really high level of scientific rigor, and I bring the receipts, but I also always try to create a safe space for learning something that doesn't conform to your previously held beliefs, because I think that we really need to kind of, I just sort of think of it as a really comfortable room where you can go and sit and be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Because it is really challenging, especially now. The internet is so big, right? There's every possible opinion is out there now, and it is so easy to just surround yourself with the people who already agree with you. So to invite somebody to come over and maybe be open to new information, feel that necessarily has to be done with kindness and respect and understanding. And I know that not every science communicator that's out there agrees with that approach. There are other science communicators who are as angry and fear-based and clickbaity as the people spreading misinformation. And sure, that feeds the social media algorithms, but I would rather reach fewer people with a more open and kind and still rigorous message than reach more people with anger. And so I would love to have this like way to say, here's how you do both, right? Here's how you also go viral and have every video hit 5 million views and change minds, right? And provide that kind of information that people go, oh, I don't need to be afraid of canola oil. Okay, that's great, right? I would love to be able to do both. And I have not figured out how to both feed the outrage machine that the social media algorithms want, but also communicate with kindness and compassion. And I kind of think that maybe those things are fundamentally incompatible.
Yeah, it's something I wonder about too. And I think, in thinking about at least my perception, like when I see your videos pop up on my phone, I always take that extra second because I know there's like a consistency to what you're bringing. And as you said, you bring the receipts, you bring the very rigorous approach to looking at nutrition in it. And so I wonder if that's maybe part of the solution too, is bringing that consistency and honesty in your science communication that makes people trust and build that relationship with you too.
I hope so. That's what I'm trying to accomplish. I think that we're in sort of a very interesting time in terms of digital culture, online culture, and diet culture, and kind of how those things feed into each other in a way that I don't think serves public health right now.
Yep.
And sometimes it feels like trying to steer the Titanic. Do you know what I mean? Like it's trying to steer this like giant ship that just like the rudders weren't made for this, right? We can't slow down. But it's one of the reasons why I'm so open about having been wrong in the past. And I talk about, hey, you know what? I used to believe vegetable oils were toxic and inflammatory. Like I used to believe this one. It took me a really long time, like more science than normal, to really like talk myself into, oh no, actually, here's where all the science actually is. And I was wrong, right? Like it just, every time I encounter a myth that I used to believe, I have to do an extra good job to bust it.
Yeah.
Partly because I'm correcting the record, but also because I understand, like even with a PhD in medical biophysics, like, yeah, I still bought into some pseudoscience thinking and some misinformation. Like I've still bought into some of these myths. And so we're all susceptible to it. And I think that gives me a little bit more compassion for the people who are really struggling. But I also think that kind of bringing all of those experiences together makes me a model for other wellness influencers, science communicators, to make a similar transition from spreading, let's say, a mix of good information and misinformation. Let's be generous. And let's call it misinformation, not disinformation. I really do. I mean, I know a lot of these people. I know they believe what they're saying, right? I think there's very few actual true grifters out there.
Yeah.
But I want to also model how to admit to having been wrong and how to put systems in place to prevent that from happening again, because it's not fun. It's hard enough to admit you're wrong to your spouse, like let alone like a million people online, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not a fun thing to do.
Humbling.
But I also think it's really important. And I'm hoping that by modeling that and modeling that you can be successful in bringing your audience with you into a message that's not fear-based, that I can encourage other people to make a similar transition. And I think that in that regard, it can't just be me. I can't be the only person talking about this stuff online. And I'm not the only person. But I think the more of a community we build around these types of permissive, non-restrictive, but still, nutrient-focused principles, I think the more people are exposed to it in different places, they can resonate with different types of people, right? Some people will resonate with my journey and some people will feel like they have nothing in common with me, right? Like I'm not their person to develop a parasocial relationship with online, right? And that's okay. But so the more different types of people that we can have talking about this, I think that's where this really like science, evidence-based message can then really take hold. And so part of it is inviting other wellness influencers on a similar journey.
That's a really interesting point. And I feel like that's a very fruitful place for next steps, especially as we kind of enter like a very different type of digital age than, the 2010s offered us as well. And I'm curious, like, for people that are listening that are struggling with those sorts of recovery narratives and trying to make sense of, what's myth, what's reality, what can I trust? Do you have like one action that you would recommend people take just to kind of start that? I love to throw the big curveballs at the end of interviews for people.
I wish there was really simple formula for identifying the people who are worth your follow. I don't think there is one criteria. I don't think an acronym at the end of someone's name is a guarantee that their information's good. I don't think the lack of an acronym guarantees their information's bad, right? I don't think I have a book, right? I don't think having a book means that they're grifters, right? I definitely say, look for the sales pitch, right? When fear comes before the therefore you need my blah, 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 that's generally a good sign that person's not worth your follow or maybe an unfollow.
Yes.
But I think maybe the bigger recommendation here is just to curate your feed. So even if there's not a really good way to identify the people putting out really good information, the more you see their content, you'll get a better sense of this is positive or not, right? This is good quality or not. You certainly will be able to identify the people who are trying to sell you fear. And if people are trying to make you afraid, they're not worth your follow. If people are negative and angry all the time, they're not worth your follow. And so curating where you're getting the information from, I think is the best first step. I hope I make the list. I hope I make the cut. But I think that's, just like we curate, right, in other aspects, our social media feeds, right? If you're, dealing with the loss of a pet, say, you might start unfollowing all of the people who just post how happy they are with their pets, right? You might be like, I can't handle that right now, right? So just like we might curate our social media feeds to cater to what's best for our psychology and best so that we're not like constantly doom scrolling.
Yep.
So what's best for us in other areas of our life, we can do that with diet, nutrition, information, even, recipe creators, right? Like all different aspects of this, fitness creators, and making sure that we are mainly exposing ourselves to positive science-backed messages, and know that doesn't mean that everything that comes through is going to be top quality information. But I think that is like a first place, and then open to learning, right?
Yeah.
Like be open to, oh man, what's wrong about this thing? That's how we grow as people, right? We grow when we're willing to learn and listen.
Hugely, hugely. Well, I think that's fantastic advice, and I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. I could talk to you forever, but do you mind sharing where folks can find you if they want to read Nutrivore or follow you along on your journey?
So my home base is Nutrivore.com. You can go to the Join tab in the menu, and that will show you my newsletter, all of my social media accounts. So I'm at Dr. Sarah Ballantyne on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, Facebook, Pinterest, and YouTube. And you can also link to my book from there. My book's called Nutrivore, The Radical New Science for Getting the Nutrients You Need from the Food You Eat. And it's available wherever books are sold and may be at your local library.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sarah. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. Ditto.
That was Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. I've linked her book Nutrivore and her social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at my website at AnthroDish.com under episodes. Thanks for listening to AnthroDish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out. For more AnthroDish, you can sign up for my newsletter at sarahdugnan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook at AnthroDish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're thinking about food. Intro music and production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucasound.com. AnthroDish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.